Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body.
A case can close in the time it takes to hold a press conference. Proving it right can take months, sometimes longer than anyone is prepared to wait. That gap, between the moment officials sound certain and the moment the evidence actually catches up, is where this story begins. Nolan Wells was a teenager. For several days, his family knew only that he was missing. Then, on July 6th, his body was found in the water. Within days of that discovery, before a single autopsy had even been completed, the sheriff overseeing Jackson County stood in front of reporters and told the public this was not a case of foul play. It sounded final. It was not. Months later, a forensic pathologist examining the available evidence has said something that original announcement left no room for: that manual strangulation cannot be excluded. Not confirmed, excluded.
I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly, incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning.
That distinction is small on paper and enormous in practice, and it's the reason a case many people assumed was settled is now being looked at again by investigators, by journalists, and by at least one trained medical expert willing to say, on the record, that this evidence still has gaps nobody has explained. At the center of those gaps sits a single piece of physical evidence. A portion of Nolan Wells' body was never released with the rest of him, never placed in front of the independent expert his family brought in, and never shown to the public. Whether that was standard procedure or something more deliberate is a question this case still hasn't answered. What we can tell you is what that missing piece actually was, why forensic pathologists consider it critical, and what it would take to finally put it in front of someone outside that office. If you're watching this from somewhere this case hasn't reached yet, let us know in the comments. Stories like this one tend to travel further than the local headlines that first carried them. And if you want to follow this investigation as the underlying documents become public, this is a good moment to subscribe, because most of what matters here never made it into that first press conference. To understand how a family went from being told there was nothing to investigate to hiring their own pathologist and their own attorney, you have to go back to the week this all started, and to a rule forensic science follows that this case, from day one, did not. Every forensic pathologist learns the same rule before opening a body recovered from water. You don't start with drowning, you end there, if you end there at all. It's called a diagnosis of exclusion, a conclusion you're only allowed to reach after every other explanation has been tested and ruled out. A head injury, a neck injury, a toxic level of drugs in the system, damage somewhere else in the body. To an untrained eye, any of these can look almost identical to a body that simply went under and didn't come back up. Only once each has been checked and eliminated does drowning become the answer. It isn't a shortcut, and it isn't optional. That process is exactly what the sheriff's early statement skipped. Nolan Wells had been missing for several days before his body was recovered from the water on July 6th. Within days of that recovery, no autopsy completed, no pathologist yet involved, an investigation still in its earliest hours. The public was told there was no foul play, The conclusion arrived before the examination did. To be fair, something at the scene may have shaped that statement, but a first impression isn't a documented finding, and it isn't something an outside expert can later verify. What it is powerful. Once officials say accident on camera, that framing tends to follow a case everywhere it goes, shaping how hard anyone keeps digging, and how much resistance builds against digging further. Meanwhile, the body itself was working against everyone involved. Time and water doesn't preserve evidence. It erodes it, hour by hour. Nolan's family didn't respond with public outrage. They responded with action, hiring their own forensic pathologist and retaining attorney Benjamin Crump, whose name tends to surface whenever a family doesn't trust the official version of a case. On July 10th, just days after the body was recovered, that independent pathologist carried out a second autopsy, finally able to test the state's version against the physical evidence directly. But a second look is never a clean slate. By July 10th, the body had already spent days submerged, then undergone one full autopsy. Refrigeration slows decomposition. It doesn't stop it. Every passing day had already begun erasing the details a second opinion depends on. So what did that second exam conclude? Not accident, not homicide. Something more precise and more honest. Undetermined. It's a word that gets misread constantly. It doesn't mean nothing happened, and it doesn't mean the family's concerns were baseless. It means the evidence in front of that pathologist wasn't enough to close the door on any single explanation. One side had delivered a fast, confident answer. The other, working far more carefully, admitted it couldn't be certain of anything. That isn't two experts disagreeing. That's a professional refusing to claim more than the evidence could support. Which raises an obvious question. This was a trained pathologist, with the family's full cooperation and the body itself in front of him. Why couldn't he reach a firmer conclusion? The answer has nothing to do with his skill, and everything to do with what he was never given the chance to examine. What that pathologist never got to examine wasn't lost to decomposition, and it wasn't destroyed by water. It was withheld. The front of the neck, the structures forensic examiners call the neck block, had been kept by the state medical examiner's office and never released with the rest of his body. When the independent exam began, that entire region simply wasn't on the table. That absence matters more than it sounds. Different injuries leave their mark in different places, and when the question is manual strangulation, nearly all of the relevant evidence sits in the front of the neck, not the back. The back is mostly muscle and spine. The front is where the airway runs, where the major blood vessels sit, and where physical signs of pressure would show up, if they exist at all. Forensic examiners generally look for three things in cases like this. First, the hyoid bone, a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone high in the front of the throat, largely unprotected, and in some manual strangulation cases, prone to fracture under pressure. Second, the strap muscles, the thin muscles running down the front of the neck, where compression can rupture tiny blood vessels internally, signs a trained eye can catch even when nothing shows on the surface. Third, petechia, pinpoint hemorrhages that appear when small vessels burst under sustained pressure, often visible in the eyes, the face, or the lining of the heart. None of these prove anything on their own. Together, they form a pattern, and reading that pattern is much of what forensic pathology actually is. Every one of those three signs lives in the exact region that was never handed over, which is why the reviewing pathologist could only reach one honest conclusion. Without the front of the neck, strangulation can't be confirmed, but it can't be ruled out either. That's the trap at the center of this case. No piece of evidence proves what happened to Nolan Wells. The one piece capable of actually answering the question was simply never placed in front of anyone working outside that office. Retaining tissue during a death investigation isn't unusual, and it isn't automatically a red flag. Medical examiners do it regularly, sometimes to study material further, sometimes to preserve it as evidence. On its own, that decision proves nothing, but it raises a straightforward question. If the state retained that tissue, the state examined it, and whatever they found sits somewhere inside the original autopsy report, a report that still hasn't been made public. The retention isn't the problem. The silence around it is. There's a second complication in this case that looks simple until you understand how it works. Toxicology. A blood alcohol number on a lab report looks like hard fact. In a fresh case, it usually is. This wasn't a fresh case. After death, as a body decomposes, bacteria become active, and they can generate alcohol on their own, with no connection to anything the person actually drank. In a significantly decomposed body, that internally produced alcohol can climb high enough to cross a legal threshold without a single drink involved. Given how long Nolan's body spent in the water, any alcohol reading has to be weighed against that fact, not taken at face value. A careful examiner accounts for the degree of decomposition and checks it against other chemical markers before drawing conclusions. Treat that number as simple proof of intoxication without that context, and you're not looking at evidence, you're looking at half of it. So now there are two separate problems sitting on top of each other: a piece of physical evidence that was never released, and a toxicology result that can't be trusted without context nobody outside the state has provided. Both lead back to the same place, a report the public still hasn't seen. And around the same time all of this was surfacing, the tone coming from officials who had once sounded so certain began to change. Not long after, a reporter showed up in person, pushing past prepared statements for something closer to a direct answer. What came back sounded different from the confidence of those first few days. The same officials who had once called this an accident now described the case as still under active investigation. Both of those things cannot be true at once. A matter is either settled or it isn't. This one, it turned out, never fully was. When pushed for specifics, officials offered little beyond pointing toward other departments. That evasiveness is what got people asking harder questions, not accusations, just reasonable ones. In a county this size, the people running an investigation often know each other personally, sometimes closely. That fact alone doesn't prove anything went wrong. But it does raise a fair question about how independent a review can really be when the people conducting it aren't strangers to each other. It's the exact same question that led Nolan's family to bring in someone from outside the system in the first place. So here's where the case actually stands. A toxicology reading that means something different depending on who's interpreting it. An official position that grew noticeably less certain the moment someone asked a direct question. A family that has never asked for anything beyond transparency. And a public left wondering whether a process can really investigate itself. Two separate problems, one rooted in science, one rooted in process, and both trace back to the same unreleased document. The original autopsy report that nobody outside the state has ever seen. There's a meaningful difference between a case being unsolved and a case being unfinished. Unsolved suggests the answers are gone for good. This one is unfinished because the answers still exist. They simply haven't been made public. Three specific things would change that. The original autopsy report, which could explain the body's condition and why certain tissue was held back in the first place. The retained neck tissue itself, which hasn't been destroyed, only withheld, and could still be examined by an independent expert if access were granted. And a toxicology report interpreted properly, with decomposition accounted for instead of a raw number presented on its own. None of that requires speculation. It requires release, and it requires access. To be fair, no crime has been proven here, and nobody has been charged. The independent finding remains exactly what it was, undetermined. What isn't in dispute is the order things happened in, a conclusion reached before the examination was finished, and that single sequence is what turned this into the debate it's become. Nolan's family isn't asking for a name, and they're not asking for a conviction. They're asking for something far simpler: documented, verifiable truth. Release the report, allow access to the retained tissue, finish the toxicology, and interpret it honestly. Whatever that evidence ultimately shows, they deserve an answer they can actually stand behind. There is no ending to offer here, not yet. Only a clear sense of what it will take to get one. When those documents finally surface, they'll be examined the same way everything in this case should have been from the start. Carefully, and before anyone says a word out loud. Because the real lesson of the Nolan Wells case was never about one sheriff or one press conference. It's about how easily a confident voice can stand in for an answer, and how long it can take the truth to catch up once it does.
So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that net block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but these are just my first impressions based on watching the press report.